Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. I am joined today with a special guest. It is Dr. Leah Brilman from Seed Research by DLF. Welcome to the show, Leah.
Thank you, Micah.
It is so nice to talk with you. We have been thinking about doing this for over a year. And when I saw you at the Rutgers Field Day, the Rutgers Fine Turf Field Day in July, I was reminded we really should have this conversation. And then finally, at the end of the summer, as we come into autumn, we're able to do it. So thank you for joining me.
You're welcome.
Are you a bentgrass breeder? How would you, your job title is very broad and important. It's Director of Product Management and Technical Services for Seed Research by DLF, and maybe for even more companies than that, for like DLF in general. Can you just describe a little bit about that role?
So I don't day to day do the breeding anymore, so I'm not out in the farms. But with the bent grasses in particular, I do go out and I walk all of the breeder blocks, um, probably every other week at least, to make sure they're uniform. And then I also go and look at them at places like Rutgers and look at the components going into them in turf. And then I've also do with bent grasses in particular, I do spend quite a bit of time actually in the seed production fields, making sure they're very uniform, that we don't have anything we're not expecting in them. And so even though for most of the species I don't do day-to-day breeding, I still am very much hands-on with the bent grasses, which is probably has been and will continue to be my forte, and I guess one of my passions. Um, I have bred many species, and I spend quite a bit of time. And I work with the breeders. I try to look at I work with them on what we need in varieties, and trying to make sure we bring them to market, and work with growers also. But then I also work with our sales staff and our customers to make sure that they know what we have, and be a support on data, and what's out there. Today I was answering questions on how do you get rid of this weed in this particular grass species, right? So there's all sorts of things you end up having to do.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a wide-ranging job, because I know that sometimes golf course superintendents, when they're planning to do a regrass or a new build, they will want to consult with you about the advice about the best seeds or the best seed blends that they might use. And so it's everything from very hands-on like that, and then you can communicate that back to the breeding team or the production
yes.
side. And then you're also involved with that breeding and with the production. So that's a lot of irons in the fire, I guess.
Yeah, and there are a lot of irons in the fire, but um, I enjoy it. I'm pretty passionate about grasses and turf grasses, and um,
So am I. And
so
so let's talk about velvet bentgrass for a minute, because when I contacted you last year, I asked a question. I said, "Is there any velvet seed available?" Because I'd been in Finland, I believe. Well, I mean, I definitely was in Finland, and I think that's where these questions came up about where people could get velvet bentgrass seed, because some golf courses there, I believe, do have velvet bentgrass, and people were thinking that that is a good grass that they'd like to use. And they told me that as far as they knew, there wasn't any seed available. And I haven't heard much about velvet bentgrass. And I wanted to ask you, is there seed available, or is that something that's not even
I
produced these
I
days?
do not know. Okay, what happened was their velvet bentgrass has never been huge demand. Okay, and when you have limited demand for a species, what you end up with is like you put in one field, and if something goes wrong with that one field, then like it gets a weed or the germ, all of a sudden you don't have production, right? And it gets and what you then also what you find is like when somebody's interested in velvet bentgrass and they can't buy it from one company, they then call another company. Well, meanwhile, the first company they talked to tries to find it someplace else also, right? And so they think there's this demand, but there's only a certain amount of and we've always been a proponent of velvet bent, but in fact, they once called me the velvety what? Velvety green queen or whatever. It was something somebody came up with. Um, we made the mistake of taking out the production of SR 7200, which is Avalon in Europe. We were bringing a new one into production, and we had one of these classic failures. And in fact, it was so bad we had two of them, and we no longer had any breeder seed stock. And that was about the same time as like the economy kind of melted, and
Hmm.
and then we went through changes of ownership, and then every time we tried to bring a velvet back onto the market, we ran into problems of seed stock production. They're very hard. It's hard enough to get acres for creeping bent grass. It's very specialized production for doing bent grasses. But for something like velvet, it's even harder because once you have it in the soil, then you're kind of like the next thing, it's going to be hard to get rid of it to move back to, say, creeping bent grass and make sure it's pure. And so there becomes these issues in production. So we had certain growers that were growing for us, and part of the thing that went on was retirements. You know, they would retire, their children were no longer interested that much in doing this very specialized thing, and maybe it got replaced by blueberries or hazelnuts or something that was different to produce. Bent grasses in general are probably there are hardest species to produce because of they have to be so pure, they need irrigation, and they tend to have to be smaller acres just to get that precision. So it became like it just went back and forward. Every time we tried to bring one in, we ended up with problems with it.
Hmm.
Um,
So 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 you're saying basically there's no, certainly from DLF you're not producing anything in Oregon. Is you're
Not right
saying that?
now. Right now, what we're doing, we have the last few years we've been able to buy some legendary um, Lebanon seed had some legendary in production, and DLF in Europe had an agreement that they were going to buy a certain amount of it, and so were we. Last year, the field failed. This is what happens, and so the current. I've heard that we may be able to get some coming into this spring. Okay, they put the field back in. I actually put in our planting plan because I think one of the mistakes we've been doing is we have been trying to establish our velvet bent in the fall. I think we really need to establish it in the spring, have 1 year of growth before we try and move into seed stock production. So I have actually put in our planting plan that I want a seed stock field. We have another velvet bent grass, and I want a seed stock field put in this spring. And then the other thing is we've actually requested that we've got some seed, and we're going to try and put it back into the DUS system in Europe because that's the other part of our demand is in Europe, but it has to go through that distinct, uniform, and stable testing system in Europe before we can, and that's a 2 to 3 year process before we can sell it there.
That's right. That's a special regulation in Europe for a
Yes.
particular variety, right? So
Yes.
you can't just take like 007 XL bentgrass and sell it immediately in Europe. They'd have to test it for multiple years and then say, okay, this one is allowed. It's a distinct variety. Now we'll allow it.
Yeah, it's a distinct variety. But what's interesting to me, always has been, is they do not accept things like disease resistance as a difference. It has to be a phenotypic difference in plant characteristics.
Right. So phenotypic means how it looks and how it,
How it looks, yes.
right? Wow. Wow. So, but doesn't it look different if it's like AU Victory covered in dollar spot versus
But they don't even
007XL?
look at it. They don't even look at it in turf. They look at it as space plants
Wow. Wow.
in measured character, like our PVP things, and it's in a government system that does this.
My,
So
what's the
it's
purpose? What's the purpose of that type of regulation?
restrained trade anyway. That's what I would say. But supposedly they want to prove that each one is distinct, so you're not is they're all just not copycats. Okay.
That yes, but it would seem that you'd want to include things like disease resistance
Disease resistance
and
is the
drought
most
tol.
important
Yeah,
things. As a breeder, that like trumps everything else. Like in bent grasses, dollar spot resistance trumps everything, followed by brown patch, anthracnose, you know, a few of these others. But, you know, disease resistance, perennial ryegrass in the US, gray leaf spot
hmm,
is and now actually it's becoming, besides brown patch, more of a concern in tall fescue. You know, to me, it is and should be disease resistance. And because I that's the only way we can really re- reduce a lot of our inputs is that's the big reason why you should get disease resistant cultivars.
hmm. Well, that's that's interesting. This is a very complex topic, and
Yes.
for bentgrass seed production, I'm aware of the Willamette Valley, and specifically the northern Willamette Valley from about the Salem, Oregon area up to Canby, Oregon, is certainly the main spot, as far as I know, where creeping bentgrass is produced in the United States. And I presume that's also the world center of bentgrass seed production. What are other locations where creeping
There
bentgrass seed
is
is
a
are
little
produced?
there used I don't know how much. There used to be some produced in Washington, by Jacqueline. I do not know if they're still being produced there anymore. Um, Now that Berenberg owns. So, but that used to be. Um, New Zealand produces some, but New Zealand has to have in fact, we've been trying to work with the part of our company, PGG Wrightson, to see if we can get colonial bent grass because that tends to be their forte in New Zealand. But the problem has been that they can't tell us they're going to have poannual free seed until it's at least 2 years old. It's they don't have the chemistry or whatever to produce poannual free seed um, as easily. So
What until can you clarify for me until what is 2 years old? Until the seed field?
until the seed field is 2 years old, because they have to get it to a certain size before I think they can use some of the chemistry they use.
Mm-hmm.
And because we've been going back and forth trying to see if we could get or if we could just import our biggest problem with the colonial bent, or as they call them, the brown tops, in New Zealand and in Europe that have been bred there. And they do produce both of those in brown top or colonial in New Zealand and in Europe. Our company, all of our production for creeping bent is done here in the States,
Okay.
but brown top is done in Denmark, I think a little in Netherlands, and in New Zealand.
Okay.
But
So that's, and I think in New Zealand it's on the South Island
yes,
primarily. Uh,
yeah,
I was I was down there for a conference a couple of years ago, and I went to the PGG Wrightson facility where they do breeding and testing. They have a big testing lab there, and
yeah.
that was near Christchurch, and it's really interesting for people who know golf. They'll know Royal Melbourne Golf Club, and you can go into their warehouse and you can find some bags that are not for sale. They're very prominently not for sale, and it's the Sutton's mix that they custom grow for Royal Melbourne Golf Club. So
But what's interesting is if
that's
you
cool.
actually, because I have actually been there when they've been growing those plants. I was there years ago when Wrightson first started it before they were part of PGG.
Hmm.
And I actually went through those and classified them. And they're all not all straight, at least the original ones, brown top bent. Some of them would classify closer to a stolonifera um, cross with the capillaris.
Okay.
There there
Like
was there
a hybrid
there's
type.
hybrids, and I have found quite a few hybrids when I go out. I call them colonial creepers or creeper colonials, and based upon segregation. And then some of the original ones that came out of Royal Melbourne, some of the first ones, they were sterile. They couldn't get any seed off of them at all. Some of the first ones they collected. And I went through a lot of those. So is it exactly what came off there? No, because some of them would not produce any seed. Okay. Is it related to it? Yes, it's related to it, but it's never exactly the same because I went through a lot of those plants and I ran a taxonomic screen on them. Let's put it that way. And there were some different things in there that they didn't read the books, just to say that, okay, on what they were supposed to be.
Yeah, the grasses themselves didn't read the books.
No,
They
they
it
did
was
not
all
read
over
the
the place.
books.
you know,
And the thing is about colonials and creepers, they can cross. They're both tetraploids. They have one genome in common, and then the other one is related to it. So, Rutgers for quite a few years, they had some crosses of colonials and creepers trying to tease apart some of the genetics because the colonials tend not to get dollar spot where the creepers tend not to get brown patch. And so some of those hybrids, they were trying to tease apart some of those characteristics.
that's a good point that I want to ask about, and it's related to the use of brown top bentgrass, which Americans call colonial, but I think in the rest of the English speaking world, it's usually referred to as brown top.
Yeah.
Brown, not because the leaves are brown, but I believe when a
When the
meadow,
seed head is mature, it's brown.
yeah, so you'd have a meadow of that grass 200 years ago, and people would call it brown top because it's got the seeds up and it's brown.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and so that's a grass that's used a lot in New Zealand. It's a grass that when people would refer to bent grass, I think in the UK they would often be referring to common bent grass or brown top bent grass, and that's a grass that's not so commonly used in the United States. But didn't you just say that the colonial bent or the brown top bent tends to be relatively resistant to dollar spot?
Yes, but it tends to get brown patch.
But if I'm in British Columbia or if I'm in Portland, Oregon, where do I have severe brown patch pressure?
No, the big problem has been with, okay, A, just like the velvet bent, the demand has not ever been as good as high for brown pat for the
Brown
brown
top.
top or colonial. And the and when you look at it actually in Europe, a lot of times it's used in combination with um, slender creeping red fescue and chewing's fescue.
Hmm.
They use it with the colonial bentgrass. And again, yeah, brown patch isn't a huge concern here, um, but part of it is the chemistry to help you keep out poanua, and the management strategies are somewhat different. In okay, if you think there isn't as much labeled for creeping bent grass, you try and find anything that has a label for colonial or brown top bent or velvet bent grass, and that's not just in usage, it's also in seed production. Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, I had a chance to visit some seed production fields in Oregon for creeping bentgrass this past May, and I I was surprised at how intensively maintained those fields are. They're irrigated at very special times, and there are treatments made to control weeds, to prevent weeds, and even growth regulators are used to. I believe the growth regulation is to help make it easier to harvest. Is that why the growth
That's
regulators
partially
are
it,
used?
but it also helps. Um, Before they started using it, both they use PGRs in both almost all of our turf grasses now. They
Seed
use
production.
plant growth regulators, bent grasses, ryegrass, tall fescue. We use it. What used to happen, and especially in bent grass, was they would lodge, they would fall over
Hmm.
before they had actually pollinated. And that actually makes their pollination not near as effective if you're down here and not waving in the breeze, right?
Okay.
So it limits your yield potential. So if you can go in there and actually use a PGR and hold them upright through pollination, then you're more likely to get more yield, more seed off those plants.
So it helps to keep the seed head upright and
Yes,
instead of falling over, which is technically called lodging.
yes.
That's it's it's so fascinating to know about the seed production to produce something that then people manage at 3 millimeters or 4 millimeters or an eighth of an inch height of cut. But then it's also something that's involved, with farming it and figuring out how to maximize the seed production and make sure that that seed doesn't have any weeds in it. It's pretty cool. So, do you think? Let me ask the question like this: do you think there's a potential? Are there climate areas in the United States where brown top bent could be used more than it currently is?
Well, yeah, I always thought that and we did have somewhat of a market for that also, and then we again ran into problems with production. Um, and to be honest with you, we've got production guys and they're trying to place fields for, I don't know, 30 million pounds of perennial ryegrass. They get very upset when I ask them to plant fields for, you know, 20,000 pounds of colonial bentgrass and and they, they're looking at the big picture. I'm looking at the high end market picture, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
some of these things. So it gets to be interesting. But is there a market? Yes. I mean, the Pacific Northwest, we did have, you know, well, when Chambers Bay was originally planted, it did have some colonial bent with
Mm-hmm.
the fine fescues, and that was actually had come out of the trials at Puyallup there as some of the best things. But then as they prepared for the open, They changed some of the course, and they changed some of the plantings, and then they let it get a little crispy, shall we say, during the open when it was held there. And if you, I don't know if you remember what it looked like that particular
I
week.
I I was there that week, Leah. I was help. I think I was painting cups or something like that. So I got an up close look at those greens. I will say the roots were pretty impressive, even though the surface was crispy and the soil was dry.
Well, and the
The
thing
the
was,
roots were the
that was
roots
the
were
way
incredible.
it was really meant to be, and it was, but it wasn't the best demonstration for the people watching on TV, okay, and of what these species can do.
Yeah,
And
it
and
it's something that people wouldn't typically see, and it was really fun to be there and get to see it with my own eyes. I I will mention something that I've seen in New Zealand that makes me more. It kind of opened my eyes to brown top bentgrass in a way that I hadn't seen before, or I hadn't been aware of it. Maybe I'd read it in articles or read it in books, but I saw as I took a trip, I flew to Christchurch and I spoke at a conference and visited the PGG Wrightson area. Then I flew up to Wellington and we took a road trip with some golf course superintendents from New Zealand who brought me up to Auckland, and we visited a number of golf courses along the way. And I got to see some brown top bentgrass greens that to me seemed relatively low maintenance. They were completely POA annua free, and they were maintained at a pretty low pH with the soil pH in the 4.5 to 5 range, something like
and
that.
I think that's part of it is, you've got to have the right system for them to work, and you have to be committed um, to making it work. I mean, there are places in this country, in the U.S., where it could work, um, but it the guy down the road doesn't have it, right? And so it makes it more difficult. What's interesting is when you actually look, there's been some recent work in by the Scandinavian group on creeping bent with fine fescues compared to velvet bent with fine fescues and brown top with fine fescues. And if you actually put it on that fescue maintenance program, the new creeping bents perform very similarly to the brown top. The velvet's probably a little better. But the thing is again, keeping your nutrition. Don't feed it like it's poanua is the big thing. In
Yeah,
don't maintain it like it's poa.
we've got so many standard recommendations about keeping your pH up. Keep your pH from 6.5 to 7, and keep your calcium up, and keep your magnesium up, and keep your potassium up. I just wrote on the blog post recently about recommendations for potassium that were 10 times higher, 10 times more. So it's the equivalent of me making a recommendation for 1 pound of potassium per 1,000 square feet per year, which is 50 kilograms per hectare. And the recommendation that the golf course actually received from two different reputable sources was for 10 pounds of potassium per 1,000 square feet per year, or 500 kilograms per hectare. It's a 1,000% difference. And if you're going to maintain bent grass, to me, it seems more likely that you're going to have really good bent grass without so much. Certainly, you wouldn't have strong POA if you keep your pH at 5, you keep your potassium down, and you don't flood it with calcium and magnesium. And
Yeah,
I don't understand why. I think I think there's a lot of people that know this, but that message is like a secret, and you still see the mainstream recommendations just don't change at all.
I know. Well, and sometimes I have, I don't know. It is it they the mainstream things, it doesn't seem to change, but I really think we were putting too much potassium on these things. They don't need it. You need to, and I think we're creating some of our own problems. We're creating our own problems. Why do we get POA in it? Because we manage for POA. Um, why do we? And if we've got POA, then we need to do all this top dressing to protect the crowns because the anthracnose. I mean, Oregon State does great work, but I love when I go out and look at their anthracnose trials, and the creeping bent that's in there is perfectly healthy, while the poa annua is just eaten alive by anthracnose. Um,
I saw I was there in May also, and I visited Chaz and saw his long term cultivation trial that's
yeah,
on that um, that's on that POA green. It's a sand based green with 100% POA, and then he's got some plots that get top dressed, some that don't. Some get top dressed at double rate, some get half rate, some get none, and then it gets solid tine aerification, hollow tine aerification, or none. And of course, it's most interesting to see, show me the plot that gets no sand and no holes punched in it. And we go there. Sure enough, that's the one that has some bentgrass in it. And then I asked him, I'm like, well, it looks like maybe the bentgrass, do you think it's because it's less disruption that the bentgrass is growing over? And if I remember right, Chaz said, well, actually, this kind of gets scarred in the summer. It gets some algae in the summer, and then the POA dies, and then the bentgrass invades. So it wasn't quite that bentgrass was there and overgrowing it, but he phrased it more as like the POA was so bad that the bentgrass invaded. But the thing that I can see as a first time visitor is, wow, this one has, let's say, 20% bentgrass in the plot, and the other ones that get conventional maintenance, they're all POA.
yeah. And the thing is, what's interesting is in the UK, they've actually been doing quite a bit more of interseeding. And some of the people, they're actually been interseeding both creeping bent and brown top bent into their POA greens. And at a certain point, then they've been able to reduce inputs significantly. And they don't really care which one wins between the creeper or the brown top. They just want a surface that doesn't take as much inputs, is basically what they're after. And I think in the Pacific Northwest, it can work too.
Yeah, I think so. I want to, because this is the ATC double cut, I want to share with everyone something related to bent grass on the ATC website. And then I want us to turn our discussion towards interseeding, which you mentioned, because I get to see a lot of interseeding in Japan. And I think interseeding in Japan of bent grass into bent grass is a little bit different than the way people think of interseeding in the United States, where it's usually interseeding of bent grass into a POA or bent POA stand. I want to hear your advice about that, your take on that, and let's talk about interseeding a little bit. But first, let's share with everybody. And if you're listening to this on the podcast, I will put a direct link to this in the show notes. I have on the ATC website, I have posts that are tagged by various topics. If you go to the ATC website, if you go to the top menu and you go to blog and then you go to topic list, it will bring you to a word cloud that you can see with all the different topics. One of those is bentgrass. So we can go to the bentgrass tag, and there are so many posts about bentgrass, such as radish seedlings on a bentgrass nursery after fumigation, and
I have to read
competition.
that one.
Yeah, there's so many. So I was looking through this. I think that was page 2. So this is page 1. We got no POA after 16 years when I visited Bob Rayleigh, where he's got some beautiful bentgrass greens in Western Maryland. I've got there's all kinds of posts about bentgrass. So that's the link that I want to share. That's what we give the ATC double cut treatment to, is that if you're interested in bentgrass, go check out everything I've written about it on the ATC website, and you can find that at the bentgrass topic. Now, back to our interesting discussion. What does interseeding? What does interseeding mean compared to overseeding, or in contrast with overseeding? And what's the difference between overseeding, interseeding, and if we're talking about interseeding bentgrass, how often should that be done? Is it effective? What are the effective methods? Tell me all about it, please.
So interseeding, I tend to call it interseeding when we're trying to make a change either in species and or cultivar is interseeding, and it's like cool season into cool season, and it's a permanent change. Overseeding I tend to utilize for what we do in the southern areas where we introduce cool season grass into warm season grasses for that winter color or the winter performance and wear tolerance. And we hope to go back to warm season grasses in the in the spring or early summer. And that's how I tend to distinguish between them. Is it correct? I don't know, but that's what I tend to use. So interseeding could be bent into POA or bent into bent. Now in Japan, they don't have the list of fungicides and things that can be utilized in the US, just like much of Europe is the same way in other countries. And so what they tend to do is they interseed to add in new genetics and to hopefully, you know, expand the genetic base and get ones that are better adapted to it. And it's almost a regular part of their maintenance schedule is just some seed very frequently during the summer. And actually, bentgrass loves to come up during the summer. It's the kind of the warm season grass of cool season grasses. It loves warmer temperatures for actually germination and establishment. And it does. And, we've had many pictures from Japanese where here's half of a green that they didn't interseed and here's half they did. And you can tell it's denser, it's thicker. It's Could it be partially because they tend to use spike seeders very often, so they're getting some sort of aerification at the same time? Yeah, that could be part of the influence, but it's consistently they seem to be able to do a change in genetics, and they do it almost as a regular part of maintenance. In this country, we've worked quite a bit with some superintendents who wanted to change cultivars but didn't have the time or the money, or they didn't want to close up at all for a renovation, for instance, right? For killing off and either sodding or seeding from the beginning. And so they would start an interseeding process. So we worked with Mark Woodward at Whisper Rock in Arizona. And his original intention was when he started doing this was kind of to they had old L93 greens was they were thinking of renovation and kind of to hold it off for a little bit. They actually held it off longer than they thought because they started to see in the first they did it in September, and even in the first winter, they were getting more clippings off during the winter, so they were getting more growth during the winter, and that was their big thing was they were getting no winter growth, and that's when they need it because that's when all their play is in the middle of the winter, and so they did it for 2 years on one of their courses, and they liked it, so they went ahead and started doing it on the second course and interceded, and you could see there was a few places where they left where they hadn't done it. You could really see that yes, there was a significant difference in going on. We've also had guys who've gone in and we would call it interceding, but what they've done is they've gone in and done like two treatments. They tend to be primarily POA or POA Annua, bentgrass, Kentucky bluegrass fairways in particular, where they've hit them with a couple shots of glyphosate, and then they've come back and interseeded, and they've been able to reopen in like 8 weeks. But they come in August, and again, it's coming in when the temperatures are still warmer. You tend to get better establishment of that creeping bentgrass.
It, does bentgrass germinate from a certain minimum temperature to a maximum temperature?
We usually say we like the soil temps to be 50. You can get some that will come up at a little lower than that, but you get much lower percentage. Um, we really like, one reason I like to do it in August through is there's a point in there where Poa annua starts germinating, and it's about September 15th in a lot of the Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. There's a soil temp. When it gets down to that soil temp, that Poa annua starts germinating. You really want to do anything you're going to do with that soil, disturbing that soil beforehand, because you're just asking for Poa to germinate. That's why, and I know these guys do it, but this aeration that they do and they wait till October 1 to do it all the time, they're just asking for Poa annua germination in those holes. And if they don't put any seed in it, even though it may not be the best time for bent, the only thing that's going to come up in those holes is Poa annua.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we should be very careful about the aeration that we do and really have a good reason to do it. I used to recommend trying to aerify a certain amount of the green per year. So to say, let's make sure that we punch holes in 15% or 20% of the green area per year. And I didn't really care when you were doing it, but it was just like, make sure you do this enough times that you impact that much area without really thinking about why. It was just because somebody had told me that that's how we should do it. And so I
Well,
believed them. And now it's like you can actually cause problems by punching holes at the wrong time if you, if you, and
you
so
can
if you don't
stress
need to
that
do it,
plant if you can stress the plants. If you don't need it, don't do it. Okay, but and I'm like you. I used to believe that, and then I started talking to people. Then I started reading. Then I started looking at what was going on, and I came to the conclusion. And I'm a believer is if you do need to do something, you're better off doing maybe spiking or ninja tines or something that if you do need to get some more oxygen to a root zone for whatever reason, but don't put big holes in. I think you tend I number one, golfers hate the damn things. Okay? And who are you trying to satisfy but the golfer, okay? And I think there are some cases where you do need to maybe pull more plugs, but I really don't think it's as frequently as people do it.
yeah, I think that we will look back on the past 20 years of golf course maintenance and like we look back on the 1970s now and we say, why were people putting a pound of nitrogen per month on putting greens? And we look back on that and say that was crazy. And and I think people might look back 20 years from now and say, why were they putting so much sand and punching so many holes? If
Yeah.
they were saying out of this side of the mouth that they're trying to they're doing this for the purpose of making the surfaces smooth and true in tournament condition, but you why would you do that when during a tournament you would absolutely never punch holes or put sand the week of a tournament? So
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense. And I think people in the future may look back on the past 20 years of maintenance and say, what was that all about?
Well, and I did. I'll be honest, but then I started looking, listening, and I think it's important um, to listen to people who were achieving. excellent performing greens without this, right? And we were one of the best things I tell people is if you want creeping bent, maintain it as creeping bent, not like it's poor annua. Number two, our new creeping bents, keep them really low on nitrogen unless, watch what you're doing. All you do is if you've got thatch problems, you created it, okay? Um, by how you maintain, how much nitrogen you put on. Um, don't grow problems is basically what I think.
Yeah,
And
there was. Do you remember that article from Agronomy Journal that Dr. Breedy wrote? I think it was maybe Baldwin and Breedy were the authors, and they said that this was 15 years ago or so, but they'd found that the newer bentgrass varieties back then, which at that time were 007 and T1, those type of names, they could have a greener color and better turf quality at lower nitrogen rates when compared to the older bentgrass varieties such as Pencross. And that's something that is an article that I don't hear a lot about, but that was a generation or two of breeding ago, and I think that that's gone even farther to where you can really produce some fine surfaces with the newer bent grasses with nitrogen rates that are so much lower than what people used to use in the past, or that the type of nitrogen rate that you'd need to maintain a good Pencross green.
and you know Pincross, I'd hear people, they were doing, they do this study, and they even now they do it on a Pincross green, and I says, why are you doing it on Pincross? Well, because a lot of greens out there are still Pincross. I says, are they really? Have you really gone and interviewed people to see how many Pincross greens are still out there? How many people haven't done any interseeding? Um, you know, when I used to do collecting, you used to be able to tell the Pincross greens. Okay, you could tell the old South German bent greens, because there were still some of them. There's much less of those out there anymore. And the Pincross greens, you could always tell because you could see those segregants in there. That purple one, it would always be in there no matter what you did. Okay, and I think there's a lot less pin cross out, at least pure pin cross that hasn't been interseeded. And the pin cross that's out there is probably still more of those ones that are pin cross POA than anything else. Um, well, I was just thinking about your potassium statement. I last year I went to Wisconsin, and Doug Soldat has a plot of bent that I don't think he's put potassium on in like 20 years, and it's pretty purple at times, but it doesn't have any POA in it. And
Mm-hmm.
if all he has to do is add just a tiny bit and you don't get that purple coloration, and again, you don't have any POA in it, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and I think he
so,
he
but
he
that's a
may
long
do.
term study.
Yeah, and he's doing that with potassium, and I think he's doing that with phosphorus also. And you can get that response with
Yeah.
both of those grasses, and I think maybe he's getting that with his phosphorus one also. And the potassium, it's
Yeah.
interesting. They do research at Wisconsin where they found they couldn't figure out what was going on because they expected that the grass would get potassium deficiency, and they were harvesting a good amount of potassium in the leaves, and they were removing the clippings, and the soil test potassium was like 25 parts per million. It's relatively low, and they were not adding potassium, and the grass continued being fine, and they figured out that the top dressing sand they were adding had so much potassium in mineral form, and creeping bentgrass roots are somehow able to access a lot of that potassium. So they weren't thinking of the top dressing applications as being a fertilizer addition, but that's what the effect was. So they actually were supplying more potassium than the grass could use simply by adding sand top
By
dressing.
adding the sand. And what's interesting is a lot of, and I hadn't even thought about the potassium, but a lot of those up in that area, it's calcareous sands, and so it's a very different sand than you get other places. And I I think there's just a different performance, and they build those greens with those calcareous sands too, when they're up in that area, because that's what they can get.
And
Um,
so you can have bent grass that's just fine in a calcareous sand. Calcareous means there's some solid form. Calcium carbonate is part of the solid phase of the soil. So you've got solid mineral calcium carbonate, which is agricultural limestone, and so it's in a rock form in the soil, and that means your soil pH, if you've got enough calcium carbonate in the soil, your pH will be about 8.2 or 8.3. If you have a small amount of calcium carbonate in your calcareous sand, then you'll often have a pH of 7.7, 7.8, that type of range. And you can have really amazing creeping bentgrass greens at that pH. Then you can also have amazing the greens. One of those posts where I said, let's see, I'll bring up my other screen. One of those in the blog post that I was talking about was, I need to scroll to the next page. Where was it? Oh yeah, no POA after 16 years. If you look at that, which is, I'll put a direct link to this, the bentgrass tag on the ATC website. If you go to that, read the no POA after 16 years post, what you will see is those. I think I wrote there. If not, I will tell you. The soil pH there is 5. So there's pure bentgrass with no POA, pH of 5. There, creeping bentgrass has a wide range of pH adaptability at which you can have some pretty amazing surfaces. So I think that's important to remember and be aware of. And just it's a very efficient, it responds really well to nitrogen, and it will grow a lot if you put nitrogen. But if you don't need it to grow a lot, don't put the nitrogen, and the grass will just be an amazing putting surface. So that's something that I think is even more true with the newer varieties. And I'll just add one more thing, Leah, about Japan. Something else in Japan is it's really hot in the summer. I think a lot of Americans, maybe some Europeans, have the idea that Japan is pine forests and rocky coastlines and relatively cool temperatures. But what you find in the summer is the temperatures are more like Singapore or Bangkok than they are like Seattle. They are. It's so hot in the summer, and bentgrass doesn't grow so well in Singapore or Bangkok, in these tropical places. And the new bentgrasses, when they have successful interseeding, you just see tremendous improvements in summer performance of the greens, and so much more density in the sward at the end of the summer. And that's another reason, in addition to the disease resistance, they get much better heat tolerance and summer tolerance by doing that interseeding.
yeah, I think there's a lot of, they do very well, and the new ones also tend to grow better in cool temperatures. And that used to be also when we lost the battle with Poa annua, was if they stopped growing when it went cool and the Poa annua was still actively growing, then we would lose that battle in the late fall, early spring with Poa annua. So now that we've actually been able to move our bents and they keep actively growing more in the fall and early in the spring, that gives them a more of a competitive edge with the Poa annua.
Thank you. I'm going to ask about zoysia grass real quick, and it's because I occasionally have people ask me if they can get zoysia grass seed, and we'll talk about Zoysia japonica. And I know there was the Zenith variety, there was the Compadre variety. What's the status of Zoysia grass seed production and availability, and variety availability right now?
Okay, this year there is actually a crop, or there was a crop this year on both Zenith and Compadre. They're both produced by Patent Seed, and they're produced in Georgia. They're actually, it's a sod company too. And if they get a freeze at the wrong time of year, they don't get any production off of it. Um, we really need someplace else to produce. Um, I grew quite a bit of zoysia here and had done work here. I had some looking at it in Texas for production, and there were things that went on and that didn't come to fruition, and changes in direction, so we didn't proceed with it. We're now re-looking at that, and actually we have someone in Australia looking at to see if there's a possibility of producing zoysia seed in Australia. One of the things with zoysia seed is it tends to have a lot of dormancy in it, and the traditional treatment was either KOH or what is it, NaOH, were used an acid kind of bath to kind of break that seed coating, that waxy seed coating on it. I think there still needs to be more work done to find a more viable way to break that dormancy in a large scale. Um, you know, I think why people probably ask you is they've seen pictures of the sod growing there, and they think, well, could somebody harvest what, you know, the guys who grow sod in your area and clean it up and maybe, and I've thought of this too, is there someplace else in Asia where we could grow some of this stuff? Um, the collection that was done years ago by Milt Engelke and Jack Murray, um, there has been some breeding work, mostly on vegetative, but Ambika, Dr. Ambika Chandra says she's got some seeded ones potentially. I haven't talked to NC State lately because they've also been doing. It would be nice if we could figure out how the heck to get more, because we're getting people asking us finally again about seeded zoysias.
Yeah, zoysia is such a nice grass for the right places, and it it has so much diversity within that genus, and we're talking about Zoysia japonica, which is the only one for which commercial varieties have been available. But Zoysia matrella is actually a better quality, and it's a much, it doesn't have as much cold tolerance, but maybe there that some with some breeding work you could get pretty good cold tolerance with some Zoysia matrella also. But Zoysia matrella has that amazing leaf texture that makes it look like artificial turf. It makes it look just so perfect. So it actually looks better than artificial turf. It's just amazing. And that's one that the grass produces seed like crazy, but it's hard to get it to germinate. And you usually, the problem is for the varieties that you want to grow as a turf grass, you don't want to have a lot of seed when it's at low mowing heights.
Well, yeah,
But
you don't want it to produce those seed heads. And part of it is you want a more uniform flush of seed heads. You want to harvest it, and then you don't want it to do it, and you want to be able to control it in some manner. It's a hard thing to do. But the problem with some of the vegetative ones, I'll see some of them out, and they get large patch, and the, which is probably their one. It's one really Achilles heel is large patch, at least in this country.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's tough. I'm going to be participating in a zoysia grass symposium at the International Turfgrass Research Conference next year, and Dr. Mila Lewis from NC State and Dr. Chandra from Texas A&M, maybe Dr. Don Locke from Australia will be joining in that. And I've actually emailed Don earlier this month, and we talked a little bit by email about zoysia seed production. So he's got his background was in forage seed production, and he knows a lot about warm season grass seed production. And so I'm hoping to get him to share some information about that. And it's he's offering to. It's just a matter of me to get that organized. So I think maybe we can all learn a bit over the next year, and maybe some people can make some progress in this because it's interesting. I want to know how to get it to germinate. I have a lot of zoysia at home. I collect the seeds. I can't get them to germinate. So
I'll send you some stuff. Some of it I do not know if it was ever published, and I have lost the computer I had some of our research on, um, because of there was stuff, and I'll see what I can find and send it to you. Okay, on how to break dormancy on it.
yeah,
Um,
I know because I visited Brian Schwartz in Tifton, and I visited Dr. Kemworthy in Gainesville, and they're both doing some zoysia breeding, and they know how to germinate their seeds because they do crosses in the greenhouse. They get seed from it, and they I think it's an alkaline treatment like a KOH
it's
or
a
something,
KOH is
potassium
one,
hydroxide, something like that.
and but some of them it's easy to do on a breeding scale, but to scale it up for use in a whole production thing has always been more of a challenge. And then what do you do with what's left? Okay, it's a dangerous chemistry, right? Um, so that's always the question on some of those things is how do you make it work?
Yeah, well, vegetative works pretty good in tropical places, but I was actually thinking for a place in northern Japan. It's an old golf course that hasn't been maintained very much. They don't have fairway irrigation, and the temperatures get warmer that far north, and they've struggled with their cool season grass. And you can see around their bunker edges, they've got some Zoysia japonica, and it's doing pretty well. And the idea is it's a relatively low budget place, so you don't want to close it down to take revenue away from the owners. It's a limited amount of revenue anyway, but you wouldn't want to close it and stop the revenue completely. And you wouldn't want to pay to resod the fairways with zoysia. But what if you could interseed zoysia japonica into those fairways that are primarily cool season and convert them into a grass that would perform better year round, would do better without an irrigation system in that particular climate. And then it's like, well, kind of there's no seed availability right now. And if there is, you're never 100% sure about your germination on it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I had an inquiry this week about zoysia, actually up into the New York area. Um, Actually, they were interested in a zoysia tall fescue combination, um, switching between it. And I've actually done Bermuda grass with tall fescue too. But the thing is, the discussion was is Bermuda grass is more invasive, and if you not controlling it, it can get away from you. Okay, much more than zoysia does typically.
In
So
that climate. Yeah, I know I was out in Long Island 11 years ago, and I was looking at grass in fairways and roughs, and sometimes I was playing golf, so sometimes I was in the rough, and I was on a municipal golf course, and I saw some zoysia growing wild, and I was also on. Actually, I was at at Fisher's Island. I saw some zoysia growing wild, which is really interesting, and it was doing pretty good. So I think there's some opportunity to use that grass.
well, years ago, I don't know if you ever saw it. There used to be an insert on the back of some of the magazines that would come in newspapers, and they would sell you plugs of zoysia. And
Yep.
people who had like beach houses on Long Island or places where they didn't want to maintain it, but they wanted green grass during the summer, they would buy these, and it was the classic thing. And all over the coast of those areas, you will find the zoysia patches from when they bought those and put them in there.
Well, that's interesting. I know Tom Cook told me that there's a lawn. I think somebody in Corvallis did that also because one of his neighbors has a bit of zoysia on some south-facing slopes.
Yeah, it's interesting what you could find.
Was that called Amazoy? Like
Amazoid, yes.
Amazoy? Yeah, I remember that. All right, Leah. Well, thank you so much. I feel like we only scratched the surface of things that we could talk about related to seed production and grass varieties, but we've reached the time, and we will go ahead and end this conversation.
And we'll have another one.
We certainly will. I'm looking forward to that. And thank you so much for all of that valuable information and very interesting information. And I can think of so many more things that we can talk about. So we will do that again before too long.
Okay,
All right.
bye.
Thanks so much. Bye bye. Thanks, everyone. I will sign off now for ATC from Trong, Thailand. I'm Micah Woods. Bye bye.